Imagine a week-long stay at your grandmother's house, a place where warm memories and comforting routines are meant to ease you into sleep. Now, imagine that comfort slowly turning into something far more sinister, where every creak and whisper in the dark hides a dark secret. In tonight's tale, a seemingly innocent family visit spirals into an unrelenting nightmare. As the days pass and the nights grow darker, a young boy finds himself haunted by an eerie scratching sound coming from the attic, a sound that grows louder and more disturbing each night. His curiosity leads him to uncover a horrifying secret, one that ties his grandfather's ghostly presence to an unspeakable terror. Stay with us until the end to discover the chilling truth behind the scratching noises and the ghastly shadow lurking in the attic. This story isn't just about fear, it's about confronting the darkness that lingers when the lights go out. Prepare yourself. The horror is about to begin. Before starting our story, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. It is very important for you to continue following terrifying stories on our channel. Spending a week at Grandma's house with my brother Isaac was something I'd always looked forward to. Grandma had a way of making everything feel warm and safe, like nothing bad could ever happen in her presence. The days were filled with sunshine, the scent of fresh flowers from her garden, and the sweet, comforting aroma of her cooking that seemed to float through every room. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where you could forget about the outside world and just exist in this cozy little bubble. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the house seemed to change. It was still the same old place, with its familiar creaks and groans, but the shadows were different at night. They stretched longer, seemed to cling to the walls, and if you stared at them long enough, you could almost swear they were moving on their own. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but there was something unsettling about the way the house felt after dark. My room was upstairs, at the end of a long hallway. The floorboards creaked underfoot as I made my way down the hall each night, and even though I knew the house like the back of my hand, there was always this nagging feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. Isaac's room was directly below mine, and sometimes I could hear him shifting in bed or whispering to himself as he tried to fall asleep. It was comforting, in a way, knowing he was so close by. The first couple of nights were uneventful. I'd lie in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling, the occasional rustle of leaves outside the window, the distant hoot of an owl. I'd always been a light sleeper, easily woken by the smallest noise, but the rhythmic creaking of the house usually lulled me into a deep, peaceful sleep. That's why, when I first heard the scratching, I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or if it was real. It started off faint, just a soft, intermittent scraping sound coming from the ceiling above me. I figured it was probably just a branch brushing against the roof or maybe some kind of animal scurrying around in the attic. I tried to ignore it, but each night, the sound grew louder and more insistent. It wasn't just a random noise anymore, it had a pattern, a rhythm that seemed too deliberate to be caused by the wind or a small animal. Small animal. On the third night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The scratching had become so loud that it was impossible to sleep through, and every time I closed my eyes, I could almost see the source of the noise in my mind, a pair of claws dragging across the wooden floor, over and over again. I knew I had to find out what was making that sound, even though the very thought of going up to the attic made my heart pound in my chest. I waited until the house was completely silent, until I could hear nothing but the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room downstairs. Then, slowly and quietly, I climbed out of bed and made my way down the hall to the attic door. The wooden ladder creaked under my weight as I pulled it down and began to ascend, each step echoing in the silence of the house. My hands were trembling as I reached the top, and for a moment, I hesitated, unsure if I really wanted to know what was up there. The attic was dark, the only light coming from a small window on the far side of the room. Dust particles floated in the air, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon outside. The room smelled musty, like old wood and forgotten memories. As I stepped inside, the floorboards groaned beneath me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Just the usual clutter you'd expect to find in an attic, old furniture covered in sheets, boxes filled with who knows what, a few forgotten toys from when my dad was a kid. But then, as I moved closer to the center of the room, I noticed something strange. There was a worn spot on the wooden floor, a small area where the wood had been rubbed smooth, as if something had been dragged across it repeatedly. I crouched down to get a closer look, running my fingers over the faded wood. It was strange, almost as if someone had been trying to erase something from the floor. The scratching sound had stopped as soon as I entered the attic, and the silence was deafening. My heart was pounding in my ears, and every instinct in my body was telling me to leave, to get out of that room and go back to the safety of my bed. But I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring at that spot on the floor, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. After what felt like an eternity, I finally forced myself to stand up and leave the attic. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen, not Isaac, not Grandma. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just an old house making old house noises. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it, something that didn't want to be found. The next few nights were a blur of restless sleep and growing dread. The scratching sound continued, louder and more desperate each time, but I couldn't bring myself to go back up to the attic. I was too afraid of what I might find. All I could do was lie in bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening to that relentless, maddening noise, and wondering what on earth could be making it. I didn't know it then, but the worst was yet to come. And by the time I realized what was really happening in that house, it was already too late. By the fifth night, the noise had grown so intense that it felt like it was inside my head, clawing at my thoughts, refusing to let me sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside, seemed to amplify the scratching until it was the only thing I could hear. I was exhausted, my nerves frayed, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was making that sound, it wasn't going to stop until I faced it. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I decided I had to investigate again. I knew it was a bad idea. I knew that whatever I found in the attic would be something I could never unsee, but I couldn't stand the thought of spending another night lying awake, listening to that awful, scratching noise. I had to know. The house was deathly quiet as I crept down the hallway to the attic door. My heart was racing, my palms slick with sweat as I reached up to pull the ladder down. The old wood creaked loudly in the silence, and for a moment, I was afraid I'd wake Isaac or Grandma. But the house remained still, and after a few deep breaths to steady my nerves, I began to climb. The attic was just as dark and musty as before, but this time, something was different. The air felt heavier, colder, as if a storm was brewing just outside the window. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I shivered, rubbing my arms to ward off the sudden chill. The scratching had stopped again as soon as I entered the room, but I could feel it lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for me. I walked towards the worn spot on the floor, the one I'd found a few nights before. But as I drew closer, I noticed something that hadn't been there before, a faint, dark stain, almost like a shadow, spreading out from the edges of the smooth wood. My stomach twisted with dread as I crouched down to examine it. The stain looked almost like blood. I recoiled, my heart pounding in my chest. This was no ordinary noise, no figment of my imagination. Something terrible had happened here, and I was beginning to realize that whatever it wasn't just a memory, it was still here, still lingering in the shadows of the attic, still reaching out for anyone who came too close. Before I could stop myself, I found my hand reaching out to touch the stain. As soon as my fingers brushed the cold, sticky surface, a jolt of electricity shot through me, like a surge of energy passing from the wood into my body. I gasped, pulling my hand back, but the damage was done. The scratching started again, louder and more frantic than ever before, and this time, it was right behind me. I spun around, my eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, just as it had been before. But the noise was relentless, filling my ears, my mind, until I could hardly think. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere, all at once, like 1,000 claws scraping against the walls of my brain. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. I stood there, frozen in place, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. But before I could gather my thoughts, something caught my eye, movement, just at the edge of my vision. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat, and that's when I saw it. Hanging from the ceiling, right above the worn spot on the floor, was the body of a man. He was swaying gently, his feet barely touching the ground, his shoes scraping softly against the wood. The dim light from the window cast eerie shadows on his face, but there was no mistaking the clothes he was wearing, brown slacks and a red-striped, white long-sleeve shirt. The same clothes my grandfather wore in the photo on my bedside table. I felt my stomach drop as the realization hit me. This was my grandfather, his body, hanging there in the attic, just as he must have done years ago. But how? Grandma had never mentioned anything about him dying like this. She'd always said he passed away suddenly, without warning, not like this. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of a box. I fell hard onto the floor, the impact knocking the wind out of me, but I didn't care. I had to get out of there, had to get away from the horror hanging above me. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes fixed on the swaying figure, but as I did, something even more terrifying caught my attention. The shadows in the room, they were moving. Not just shifting with the light, but actually moving, creeping along the walls, growing larger, darker. And they were all converging on one spot, the worn, bloody patch of floor beneath my grandfather's hanging body. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of something rotten and foul, and my lungs felt like they were on fire. I turned and bolted for the ladder, not daring to look back, not wanting to see what those shadows would do if they caught up to me. I practically fell down the steps, my feet slipping on the rungs as I rushed back to the safety of my room. I slammed the door shut behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. I stood there for what felt like hours, my back pressed against the door, my chest heaving as I tried to calm down. But the image of my grandfather's body, swaying gently in the attic, was burned into my mind. I couldn't shake it, couldn't unsee it. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the faint, rhythmic creaking of the house, and in my mind, I saw him swinging, back and forth, like a macabre pendulum counting down the seconds until it would be my turn. We spent the day going through his things, and for a while, it almost felt normal. The sun was shining, Isaac was playing outside, and Grandma seemed happy to reminisce about the past. But I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me, like a dark shadow that followed me wherever I went. As the day drew to a close, I tried to convince myself that it was all just a bad dream, a figment of my imagination brought on by the old house and the stories Grandma had told. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew that what I had seen in the attic was real, and that whatever had happened to Grandpa was still very much present in this house. That night, I steeled myself for one more evening in that room, knowing it would be my last before we went home. I could handle one more night, I told myself. One more night, and then I'd be out of this place, away from the attic and the horrible scratching sounds that haunted my dreams. But as I would soon find out, the house had other plans for me. The evening crept in slowly, with the light outside fading into a dull orange before surrendering to the deep blues and blacks of night. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to prepare myself for what I feared would be the worst night yet. Isaac was already asleep in his room downstairs, blissfully unaware of the horrors that had been plaguing me all week. I envied his innocence, his ability to close his eyes and drift off without a second thought. For me, sleep was a distant, unattainable thing, something I feared as much as I longed for. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, waiting for the first sound of that dreaded scratching to begin. The minutes stretched into hours, each one feeling like an eternity as I held my breath, straining to hear any noise from above. But the attic remained silent, eerily silent, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Finally, the clock on my bedside table ticked over to midnight, and the silence became too much to bear. I sat up, the sheets tangled around me like chains, and swung my legs over the side of the bed. Maybe the scratching had stopped for good. Maybe whatever restless spirit had been haunting this place had finally found peace. But deep down, I knew better. The house was too quiet, too still. It felt like the calm before the storm. I decided to get up and get some water, anything to shake off the suffocating sense of dread that had settled over me. As I stepped out into the hallway, the floorboards creaked under my weight, the sound echoing through the empty house. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, and headed towards the kitchen. But as I moved, something unsettling happened. Every step I took was mirrored by a faint, almost imperceptible sound from above, a creak in the attic, directly above my head. It was as if something, or someone, was following me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The sound stopped as soon as I did. I took another step, and there it was again, the same faint creak, coming from the attic. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. Whatever was in the attic was mimicking my movements, as if it were shadowing me, waiting for me to make the next move. My mind raced, torn between the urge to flee and the sickening curiosity to know what was up there. I forced myself to keep moving, each step a battle against the rising tide of fear. The creaking above me continued, perfectly in sync with my movements. It was like a game, a twisted dance between me and whatever unseen force was lurking in the attic. I reached the kitchen, my hands trembling as I poured myself a glass of water. The cold liquid did little to calm my nerves, but it gave me a moment to collect myself. As I stood there, staring into the darkness of the hallway, I knew I couldn't avoid the attic any longer. The silence was too heavy, the air too thick with anticipation. I had to know what was up there, even if it meant facing my worst fears. I set the glass down and made my way back towards the staircase. The creaking above me resumed, this time growing louder, more insistent, as if whatever was up there knew I was coming. My hands shook as I reached for the attic ladder, pulling it down with a loud, jarring creak that echoed through the house. I hesitated at the base of the ladder, my mind screaming at me to turn back, to run and never look back. But something stronger, a need for answers, for closure, drove me to climb the steps. Each rung felt like it could give way at any moment, as if the house itself was trying to keep me out. But I pressed on, my heart hammering in my chest, until I reached the top. The attic was dark, the only light coming from a small, dim bulb in the far corner. I stepped off the ladder, my feet touching the wooden floor that had been the source of so much terror. The air was thick with dust, and the shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting and twisting in the corners of the room. I walked slowly towards the spot where I had seen the figure hanging. The memory of that night burned into my mind. But when I reached the spot, there was nothing, no body, no rope, nothing but the worn floorboards beneath my feet. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe it was just a nightmare, a figment of my overactive imagination. But then I noticed something else, something even more terrifying. The floor beneath me was smooth, almost polished, as if someone had been walking back and forth over it for years. And there, in the center of the room, was a single, deep scratch, carved into the wood as if by some unseen force. I knelt down, running my fingers over the mark. It was fresh, the wood splintered and raw. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it meant. Whatever had been scratching at the floor had been doing it for years, trapped in this room, trying to escape. And now, I was in its place. As I stood up, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, coming from behind me. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat, and saw a shadow, darker than the others, moving towards me. It was tall and thin, its shape indistinct, but there was no mistaking the presence it carried. It was the same figure I had seen hanging from the rafters, the same shadow that had haunted me for days. It stopped a few feet away from me, and I could feel its gaze, cold and unforgiving, boring into me. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The shadow moved closer, and as it did, I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, as if a hand had reached inside me and squeezed my heart. I gasped, clutching my chest as the pain intensified, my vision blurring as the room began to spin. The shadows around me grew darker, closing in from all sides, until there was nothing left but the suffocating blackness. The last thing I heard before everything went silent was the sound of my own breath, ragged and desperate, as the life was slowly drained from my body. When I awoke, everything was different. I was no longer in the attic, nor was I in my room. The world around me had changed, twisted into something both familiar and nightmarish. The air was cold, almost frigid, and the walls around me seemed to pulse and breathe, like the house itself was alive. A dim, sickly light filtered through the darkness, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move and whisper on their own. I was lying on the floor, my body stiff and aching. As I slowly sat up, the memories of what had happened came rushing back, the attic, the shadow, the pain in my chest. I clutched at my heart, but the pain was gone, replaced by a numbness that spread through my entire being. It was as if I was no longer entirely myself, as if a part of me had been taken away, leaving only an empty shell behind. I looked around, trying to make sense of where I was. The room was a twisted reflection of the attic, but everything was wrong. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched deep into the wood, and the air was thick with a foul, rotting smell. The floor beneath me was the same worn wood, but now it was stained with dark, ominous marks that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. As I struggled to stand, I noticed something else, something that made my blood run cold. The shadow, the one that had attacked me, was still here. It loomed in the corner of the room, darker than the rest, its shape shifting and twisting as if it were made of smoke. But it wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had form, substance, and as it moved closer, I could see it more clearly. It was him, my grandfather. Or at least, what was left of him. His face was twisted into a grotesque mask of pain and anger, his eyes dark and hollow. He was wearing the same clothes from the photograph on my bedside table, but they were torn and stained with something dark and wet. His body was gaunt, almost skeletal, and as he moved, the air around him seemed to grow colder, more oppressive. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on the horrific sight before me. My grandfather, or whatever this thing was, stared at me, his eyes burning with a hatred that seemed to reach into my very soul. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I felt the numbness in my body deepen. My throat tightened, and I could barely breathe as he continued. "I've been here, waiting. Trapped. The house, it took me. It's been feeding on me, for years." His voice was a low, guttural rasp, filled with pain and despair. I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me, suffocating me. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a haunting. The house itself was a prison, a living entity that had ensnared my grandfather and was now trying to do the same to me. I tried to speak, to ask him how to escape, but my mouth was dry, my voice gone. All I could do was stand there, trembling, as he continued. "It won't let you go. Not now. You've seen too much. It's hungry, and it's not finished with you." The shadow of my grandfather moved closer, and as he did, the room around me began to change. The walls twisted and distorted, the symbols glowing with a sickly light. The floor beneath me cracked and splintered, and I could feel something rising up from below, something dark and malevolent. I could see it in his eyes, the same fear, the same hopelessness that I felt. He had been trapped here, consumed by the house, and now it was my turn. The walls closed in around me, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and I could feel the life being drained out of me with every passing second. I fell to my knees, the strength leaving my body. The shadow loomed over me, its presence overwhelming. I could feel its cold touch on my skin, its icy breath on my neck. My vision blurred, the world around me fading into darkness. The last thing I saw was my grandfather's twisted face, his eyes filled with regret and sorrow, as he whispered one final word. "Run." But it was too late. The house had me. I could feel it pulling me down, into the darkness, into the void where my grandfather had been trapped for so long. My body went limp, my mind succumbing to the overwhelming terror that engulfed me. And then, there was nothing. I don't know how long I was out, but when I finally opened my eyes, I was no longer in the twisted, nightmarish version of the attic. I was lying in my own bed, the familiar sounds of the house creaking around me. The air was cool, and the first light of dawn was creeping in through the window. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, a terrible, vivid nightmare. But as I sat up, I knew the truth. The marks were still on my chest, faint but real, and the memories of the night were too clear, too visceral, to be anything but real. The house had shown me something dark and terrible. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. I stumbled out of bed, my body weak and trembling. The house was quiet now, too quiet, as if it was waiting for something. I knew I couldn't stay here, not after what had happened. I had to leave, to get Isaac and get as far away from this place as possible. But as I reached the door, I heard it, the faint sound of scratching, coming from above. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that the house wasn't done with me yet. I turned slowly, my eyes drawn to the ceiling, to the attic where it all began. And there, in the darkness, I saw it, a shadow, moving slowly, deliberately, across the floor above me. It was waiting, just like before. Waiting for me. But this time, I wasn't going to run. I couldn't. I had to face it, to end this nightmare once and for all. With a deep breath, I reached for the attic ladder, my hand shaking as I pulled it down. The creak of the wood was deafening in the silence, and as I climbed the steps, I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me. When I reached the top, I hesitated, my hand on the trapdoor. This was it, the moment of truth. Whatever was up there, whatever the house had in store for me, I had to face it. There was no turning back now. I pushed the door open, the darkness of the attic swallowing me whole. The air was thick with dust, the shadows shifting and swirling like a living thing. And in the center of the room, where the worn floorboards marked the spot where my grandfather had hung, I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows around it. But there was no mistaking who it was. It was my grandfather, or what was left of him. He stood there, motionless, his eyes hollow and empty, as if he was waiting for me. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew colder with each step, and I could feel the life being drained from me, just like before. But this time, I didn't stop. I kept moving, my eyes locked on the figure before me. When I was just a few feet away, the shadow of my grandfather raised its head, its hollow eyes meeting mine. And in that moment, I understood. The house had taken him, consumed him, and now it wanted to do the same to me. But I wasn't going to let it. I wasn't going to end up like him, trapped in this house, a slave to its twisted desires. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the shadow. The cold was overwhelming, but I didn't pull back. I focused on the memories of my grandfather, the man he had been before the house had taken him. The warmth of his smile, the sound of his laugh, the way he used to hold me when I was a child. I held on to those memories, clinging to them like a lifeline. And then, something changed. The shadow wavered, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. The cold began to recede, replaced by a warmth that spread through my body. I could feel the house losing its grip on me, the shadows retreating as the light began to return. The figure of my grandfather faded, his eyes softening, the pain and anger melting away. And in that moment, I knew he was free. The house had lost, and I had won. I stumbled back, the room spinning around me as the shadows dissolved into nothingness. The attic was just a room again, the marks on the floor faded and worn. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face as the weight of everything that had happened finally hit me. But I was free. I had broken the cycle, and my grandfather was at peace. The house was just a house now, its power over me gone.